I want to start off this conversation with a quick question, a sort of Mad Lib's comparative edition, if you will. If you want to, you should pause the video and do the assignment for yourself before you continue, once you see the question and get a chance to take a look at it. What I want you to do is to fill in the blank for the following statement. I am a, or I am an blank. As you answer it, I want you to think about how you would describe yourself to someone who is meeting you for the first time. Maybe think of it as a question you'd get in a job interview, or maybe if you were sitting down and doing speed dating and you needed to tell someone who you were in 5 statements or 5 words or less. Now, it turns out this is an important question because asking someone who they are or to define themselves in just a few words gets very closely at this idea of what your identity is or what identity is. And identity is one of the most important things to a social scientist. And the same thing is going to be true with comparative politics. The answer to who you are reveals a great deal about yourself, about your personal identity, and about those things that we want people to know, and about what we know about other people, about their politics. And it also tells us something about your sense of what it would take to motivate you to engage in certain types of political actions or to affect or to change your behavior. Now, this is particularly true when identity is aggregated into social communities. Political leaders or political creatures often play upon your sense of identity when they're trying to mobilize you in the political space, or when they're trying to find some way of either getting you to challenge the state or getting you to participate in the state in ways that you otherwise wouldn't want to. For this reason, identity is one of the greatest sources of political conflict. For this set of conversations, this lesson and the next one, what we need to talk about is this question of identity. We want to define identity, get a sense of what identity is, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the types of identity that are important in the political space. The companion book goes into a bit more detail. It'll talk about some specific forms of identity, like patriotism and nationalism, or the different ways we can think about ideology. What I want to do today is spend a bit more time talking about the question of how political identity is formed. And then in the second lesson, I want to talk about a very specific type of identity, political religion or politicized religion. So to begin, let's consider the 2 primary arguments for identity formation. The first argument is something called primordialism. And it is probably the one that's most familiar to people who live in the United States, because we hear primordial arguments most often when we talk about things like race or geography. Primordialism assumes that you as an individual have an identity that is somehow based upon things ancient or things that are original, and that who you are and who you identify yourself as is a function of some type of deep history. During the Yugoslav War, or many times when we talk about events in the Middle East or in Central Asia, observers often talk about the role of tribe, or the role of the ancient, or the role of ancient religious divisions as the sources of conflict. Here in the United States, we also talk about primordial arguments such as race, or how the European experience somehow shaped whites and white identity, and how the African experience somehow shaped blacks and who blacks are today. This is the version that we're most familiar with, so it's the one that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. A more recent, or perhaps more politically accepted understanding of identity is to say that identity is a constructed concept. It's the argument that your membership in a community is somehow imagined, that what you belong to, or that who you are, who you identify with, this is often a function of how you've been categorized or how you categorize yourself, even if that happens over a couple of different generations. For example, if you've ever seen the movie Hotel Rwanda, there's this famous scene where a European is sitting at a bar trying to understand the difference between Hutus and Tutsis in the days immediately prior to the genocide that took place. What the European learns is that these tribal labels were largely created by the government under colonialism and were perpetuated under the government after the colonial master left. This means that identifying a Hutu from a Tutsi on the street can actually be quite difficult, since the markers were kind of fabricated. Now, why would you want to create this community, or why would you have this imagined community? Well, there are lots of different reasons why this might happen. Some of these might assume that communal construction comes from the outside of the group, right? So we have a group of people, and someone from the outside manufactures them into some sort of collective identity that the individual members then eventually buy into. People who have wealth or power might create these categories to ensure that they remain part of this elite privileged class, and that it's somehow harder for people at the bottom or outside of the elite class to break in or to make claims for advancement or to make claims for access to the goods or the resources that the elite possess. Some constructivists even go so far as to say that the powerful try to create this thing called false consciousness. Now, this is a Marxist idea, and that false consciousness is this idea in the minds of others that leads them to believe the current social order is actually good for them, when in fact they're not really the ones who benefit from it all that much. Think about arguments that somehow the working class doesn't benefit in the current American political system because wealth and resources tend to evolve or be transferred upward under the modern capitalist state, as an example of a Marxist argument being made from the left. Another source of this constructed community actually can result from state building. So again, if you think about the American example of the American revolutionary experience and the American motto, E pluribus unum, of many one. The idea here is that the United States comes from various cultures and various peoples who arrived from Europe or from Africa or from Asia, from around the world, and that the process of the development of American history, the process of the building of the American nation, was the process of forging these communities by creating a common set of cultural identifiers. When new immigrants come to the United States, especially the children of new immigrants, our society targets them for socialization through our schools or through our political parties or through our public media, our popular media. And we try to shape them and their identity to become more like us. That way they can participate more easily in our community and threaten us a little bit less than they would if they maintained all their own or old identifiers. Now, by doing this, we actually make it easier for the state to survive, or easier for the state to either control us or to help us out. So if I think about this, I can think of several different ways of creating or manufacturing this identity. We've talked about race and ethnicity. We could also talk about nationalism, or an identification with a particular group of people or nation. We could talk about patriotism, or the love for state or the identification with state. Or we could talk about political ideology, whether that means that you're a liberal or conservative. Your book probably also uses terms like fascism or social democrat or communism as identifiers of political ideology. Okay, so that's a little bit about this question of identity and something about where identity comes from. What I want to talk about in the next video is more specifically the question of religious identity, and trying to understand how religion plays a role in politics or the political.